There is a soup that Amish families made every winter for over 200 years, from a ham bone and a bag of dried navy beans. It costs almost nothing to make, and it delivers more fiber, more folate, more iron, more magnesium, and more of the compound that actually feeds your gut bacteria than a full carton of bone broth. This is Amish preaching soup, and the long simmer it was built on was never a wellness trend. It was just how you fed your family through January. Bone broth is not a bad food, but the story being told about it is a story about rediscovery, and the problem with that story is that nothing was ever lost. The Amish did not lose it. The Mennonites did not lose it. The plain communities of Lancaster County and Holmes County and Elkhart County did not lose it. They kept making a pot of navy beans with a ham bone every winter, the same way their grandparents made it, and their grandparents before them, and the question worth sitting with is not what bone broth contains, but what we gave up when we decided we no longer had time for the thing that came before it. That question has an answer, and the answer is not a nutrient. It is something larger than that, and we will get there. The settlers who became the Amish arrived in Pennsylvania beginning around 1737. They came from Switzerland, from the Alsace region of what is now France, from the German-speaking communities of the Rhine Valley, and they came fleeing religious persecution that had followed their Anabaptist faith for generations. They brought very little with them. They brought their faith, their farming knowledge, and their food. Among the food they brought was bonensuppe, bean soup, a pot of dried legumes simmered slowly with whatever bones the household had saved from the last cured pig or the last slaughtered chicken, stretched with onion and celery and whatever root vegetables the cellar held. It was the food of scarcity made into something that sustained a family through the hardest months of a European winter, and then through the hardest months of an American one. By the time those communities had established themselves across Pennsylvania and begun moving into Ohio and Indiana through the early and middle 1800s, the bean soup had become something more than a winter staple. It had become the meal of the church. Amish services were held not in buildings but in homes, rotating through the congregation on a schedule, every household hosting eventually. The services ran long, 3 hours sometimes, 4 hours sometimes. When they ended, the host family fed everyone, 50 people, sometimes more. The soup had been started the night before. The dried navy beans soaked in cold water in a large pot on the kitchen counter while the family slept. In the morning, before the benches were carried in from the barn and arranged in rows for worship, before the hymn books were laid out, before the first families began arriving in their buggies across frozen ground, the ham bone went into fresh water and the pot came slowly to a simmer on the back of the stove. It would stay there through the entire service. By the time the last hymn was sung and the last prayer offered and then the congregation began folding the benches back into tables, the smell of it had moved through every room in the house, into the coats hanging by the door, into the wool of the men's hats, into the air that the children were already pressing toward. That smell was not incidental. It was the point. It was the family saying, "You have been here with us all morning, and you have been still, and you have listened, and now you will eat, and we are glad you came." The soup had a name in some communities: preaching soup, church soup. In the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, it echoed the older German Bonensuppe, still recognizable in the sound of it. The name did not matter as much as the practice, and the practice was consistent across communities that had no direct contact with each other. The Hutterite communities that established themselves in the Dakotas and Montana through the late 1800s made nearly the same soup by nearly the same method. The overnight soak, the slow morning simmer, the ham bone as the backbone of the broth. Different communities, different landscapes, different decades of arrival, the same pot. They did not arrive at this through coordination. They arrived at it because the method worked. And because the method worked, it became the thing you passed to your daughter when she set up her own household and she passed it to hers. And the passing of it was so unremarkable that nobody thought to write down why. Then the 20th century arrived with a different offer. The canned soup aisle made it possible to open a can instead of soaking a pot. Then came frozen convenience meals. Then came the diet industry with its rotation of powders and protocols. Then came bone broth in a carton, marketed as the thing your ancestors knew and modern science had finally caught up to. Each substitution promised the same outcome with less waiting. Each substitution removed the one thing that the Amish had never removed. The long simmer was the first casualty of the convenience era, and it left quietly without announcement. And what it left behind was a version of winter eating that looked roughly the same from the outside and produced something categorically different on the inside. Most households did not notice the difference immediately. That is the nature of this kind of loss. It does not arrive as a single event. It accumulates. The navy bean, soaked overnight and simmered low and slow for 2 or more hours, does something inside the body that bone broth cannot do and that no amount of collagen protein replicates. The bean contains a form of starch that survives the cooking process intact, passes through the small intestine without being broken down, and arrives in the colon as food for the bacterial communities living there. Those bacteria ferment it. The fermentation produces compounds that feed the cells lining the colon wall, regulate inflammation, and support the immune signaling that happens in the gut continuously and quietly. The signaling that determines how well a body weathers a winter, how quickly it recovers from illness, how steadily it maintains the kind of low-grade resilience that never makes headlines, because it is simply the baseline of a person who has been eating well for a long time. Bone broth does not do this. Bone broth is rich in collagen protein and gelatin, and the amino acids that come from long-simmered connective tissue, and those things have genuine value. But the gut bacteria that determine long-term immune resilience do not feed on collagen. They feed on fermentable fiber, and bone broth contains none. The microbial community in the gut is not static. It responds to what it is fed. Feed it the right substrate consistently across a winter, and it diversifies, strengthens, and holds. Stop feeding it, and the community shifts. And the shift is quiet and cumulative. And the cost shows up later as something a doctor gives a different name. The long simmer is the mechanism, not the cooking time alone, but what the cooking time preserves. High heat and pressure degrade the fermentable starch in the bean. The slow pot, the 2-hour minimum, the gentle bubble rather than the rolling boil, these are not aesthetic choices. They are the conditions under which the bean delivers what the gut actually needs. The Amish were not doing food science. They were doing what their grandmothers had shown them, which turned out to be the same thing. What we gave up was not a recipe. It was a continuous, winter-long conversation between the food and the body that had been happening in plain community households for 200 years, and that stopped, in most American homes, sometime between the invention of the canned soup and the invention of the wellness carton. Think about what that means across a life. A person who ate this soup through every winter of their childhood and into adulthood was giving their gut bacteria a consistent, seasonal input for decades. The microbial community in their colon had learned to expect it, had organized itself around it, had built the kind of diversity and resilience that takes years to establish and, as it turns out, relatively few years of absence to erode. Their grandchildren grew up on Campbell's and then on Whole30 and then on bone broth, and their gut bacteria never received the input that would have given them the same foundation. Nobody made a decision to remove it. It just disappeared one convenience at a time, and the body absorbed the change without complaint and kept going, carrying the difference quietly through every winter that followed. Here is the dimension of this soup that almost nobody talks about, and it reframes everything. Amish preaching soup was never made for one person. The quantities in the original recipes, the ones documented in mid-20th century Pennsylvania Dutch cookbooks and in the oral histories of Ohio and Indiana Amish communities, are staggering by modern standards. 8 quarts of liquid, 2 pounds of dried beans, ham bones from a whole cured leg. These are not family dinner proportions. These are congregation proportions. The soup was made to feed the community, and the community understood feeding each other as an obligation that ran in all directions, not just downward from the fortunate to the needy, but sideways across the whole congregation, because everyone would eventually have a winter they could not manage alone. The soup showed up after a death. The family hosting the funeral did not cook. The neighboring households brought food, and the food they brought was this, carried in covered pots across frozen fields, set on tables in a house still arranged for grief. It showed up after a difficult birth, a neighbor arriving at the door 3 days later with a pot large enough to feed the household for a week because the mother was resting and the older children needed feeding and the father had not slept. It showed up when someone was ill through January and their larder was running thin, and they had not said anything about it because in a community that watched closely, you did not need to say anything. The pot arrived anyway. Sometimes it was left on the porch before anyone answered the door because the giving was not meant to create obligation. It was just meant to make sure you ate. It was carried in buggies through January. It was left on doorsteps before dawn. It was brought to the newly widowed and the newly arrived and the family whose barn had burned and who were rebuilding from nothing. Every household that received it knew they would make it themselves when their turn came, and their turn always came. That is what mutual aid looks like when it has been practiced long enough to become invisible. It does not announce itself. It simply shows up, warm, in a covered pot, and the person who made it is already gone. Bone broth costs $12 a carton, and you drink it alone in the morning before anyone else is awake, because the wellness industry sold it as a personal practice, a thing you do for yourself. Amish preaching soup was structurally incapable of being a personal practice. The quantities made solitary consumption almost impossible. You made enough to share, and sharing was the point. And the nourishment moved in both directions, into the body and into the relationship between the people who made it and the people who received it. We did not just lose the recipe, we lost the entire framework the recipe lived inside. The nutrients were never the point. The nutrients were just what happened when a community refused to stop feeding each other. The method is simple. It is also specific, and the specificity is what makes it work. Start with dried navy beans, not canned. The canned bean has already been cooked at high heat in the cannery, and the process that matters most, the one that preserves the fermentable starch the gut bacteria need, has already been short-circuited before the can reaches your pantry. Buy the dried beans in a bag. They cost almost nothing and they keep for a year. The night before you plan to make this soup, cover the beans with cold water in a large pot. Use more water than you think you need. They will swell overnight. Leave them on the counter and go to sleep. In the morning, drain the soaking water and add fresh cold water to cover the beans by 2 or 3 inches. Add your ham bone or ham hock. If you do not have a bone from a previous ham, a smoked ham hock from the butcher counter works exactly as well, and it costs very little. Bring the pot slowly to a simmer over medium-low heat. Do not rush this. Do not let it boil hard. The long simmer begins now, and it runs for at least 2 hours, 3 if you have the time. The water should be moving gently, barely, the surface occasionally broken by a slow bubble. In the final hour, add a diced onion, 2 or 3 stalks of celery, and a couple of carrots cut into rough pieces. Season with salt at the very end after the beans are fully tender. Seasoning earlier toughens the bean skin and extends the cooking time. When the beans are done, pull the ham bone out and shred whatever meat clings to it. Return the meat to the pot. Discard the bone. Now do the thing the Amish did without knowing why it mattered. Let the pot cool. Make this soup the day before you intend to eat it, or make a large batch and eat it over several days. The cooled and reheated soup delivers more of what the gut bacteria need than the soup eaten fresh from the stove, because cooling converts additional starch into the fermentable form. The habit of making a large pot and eating across the week was not just economy, it was, without anyone naming it, the correct method. The common mistake is the canned bean substitution. It feels like a reasonable shortcut. It removes the overnight and the long simmer and replaces them with the memory of the outcome. The soup will taste similar. It will not do the same thing. There is a shelf in most grocery stores where the wellness products live. The bone broth is there in its clean cartons with their clean claims, sitting next to the collagen powders and the adaptogen drinks and the supplements promising deep nourishment from a single daily habit. None of these products are fraudulent. Some of them are genuinely useful. But they are all products, designed and packaged and priced and marketed to a person standing alone in an aisle trying to find the thing their body has been missing. What their body has been missing is not a product. An Amish family in Lancaster County in the winter of 1887 did not wonder what their body was missing. They soaked beans on Saturday night and simmered them on Sunday morning and fed 50 people and sent the leftover home with whoever needed it most. They were not ahead of their time. They were not doing anything remarkable. They were just doing what their grandparents had shown them, which was, you keep the long simmer going, and you make enough to share, and you do not stop doing it because something easier came along. The long simmer is not gone. It was never gone. It is waiting in a bag of dried beans that costs $2 at any grocery store in the country. Soak them tonight. Simmer them tomorrow. Make enough for more than yourself and find someone to bring the rest to. That is the whole thing. That is what we lost. And that is how close it still is.